in a frozen hell laced with psychological paranoia, gasping for life on the brink of death. It was a conflict against all odds. In the waning days of 1939, the world's largest military power launched a colossal attack against one of the world's smallest nations, Soviet Union against Finland. History affords few examples of a conflict so overwhelmingly one-sided, yet so forgotten. Despite the Red Army's daunting preponderance of force, despite being starved of modern weapons, outnumbered and outgunned, Finland inflicted staggering losses to the Soviets and stood sublime in the face of peril. Using the most unprecedented of resistance attacks, and despite the overwhelming differences in men and firepower, the Red Army suffered humiliatingly as the Finnish people picked up arms to protect their freedom, honor, and culture. For 105 days, Finland waged a David and Goliath defensive struggle of unparalleled valor and determination that enabled Finland to remain a free and independent nation. The sudden whistling of shells and echoing of detonations fractured the peaceful stillness of the Finnish sky. Without warning, Soviet bombers dropped from the clouds to unload their bombs onto the capital city of Finland, Helsinki. Buildings collapsed, and fires raged throughout the city as a barrage of bombs rained down relentlessly. And within a matter of hours, the entire Finnish frontier was set ablaze, with the horizon becoming a sheet of flames. The Finnish people were now faced with a battle for life in the frozen dark silence of a hellish winter, the pinnacle of a lengthy conflict. In April of 1938, the Soviets initiated negotiations with the Finns, demanding that they cede areas of land near Leningrad, the cradle of the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin saw this as both an opportunity to expand the Soviet Union and to prevent potential Nazi assaults through Finland. The Finnish declined and made 2 counter-offers, but the Soviets accepted neither, resulting in an unsuccessful compromise. Not long after the Soviets had launched an unforeseen attack on Helsinki, Marshal Mannerheim, the commanding officer for all Finnish forces, realized that the most critical threat to Finland was on the Karelian Isthmus and sought immediate action there. Mannerheim knew the Soviet ways of war due to his time as a general for the Royal Russian Army prior to the Communist Revolution. Despite lacking artillery and armed only with conventional trenches and log-covered dugouts, the Mannerheim Line was the stronghold of the Karelian Isthmus, a formidable wall of defense empowered by the fervent spirit of the troops manning it. To compensate for their meager numbers and technological inferiority, the Finns used guerrilla warfare and fierce vigor to outmaneuver the enemy in their native terrain. On December 6th, soon after the bombing of Helsinki, the Soviets struck with 120,000 men and 1,000 tanks on the Taipale sector of the line. Unknown to the Soviets, the Finnish had ranged every inch of the land with artillery and hidden barbed wire, prepared to bring destruction to any force that gained a foothold there. But Soviet troops were not the only problem. Sending pillars of lung-searing smoke and plowing down the wire fences, Soviet tanks were armored monstrosities. The Finns worked quickly and cleverly to immobilize the Soviet tanks, jamming logs and crowbars into their wheels. And though they lacked advanced weaponry, the Finnish developed the Molotov cocktail, a simple device consisting of basic household items that effectively destroyed hundreds of Soviet tanks. They also conceived a brilliant strategy that allowed natural forces and exemplary assailants to exhaust the enemy for their physical shortcomings. Multi tactics were an effective way to divide the Soviet troops into smaller pockets of men and then taking them out with scarce retaliation. Continuing on Christmas Day, the Soviets crossed the frozen Taipale River, only to be met with a furious Finnish counterattack. Despite their massive military might, the Soviet offensive against the Mannerheim Line failed hugely, with an alarming death toll of over 10,000 men. However, in December alone, the Finnish too suffered heavily, with nearly 2,500 casualties. Many Finnish machine gunners were evacuated and unstable after having to perform such mindless slaughter day after day. The winter of 1939 was one of the most brutal the world had ever seen, but this was an advantage for the Finns. The Finnish snow camouflage allowed them to become virtually invisible to Soviet patrols. In contrast, the Soviets wore regular khaki uniforms and helmets, stopping cold against the Mannerheim Line. Soviet morale was poor. Officers and troops alike were refusing to participate in more suicidal frontal attacks. Finnish veterans voiced their pity and compassion for the poorly led, ill-clad Soviet conscripts that they were called upon to slaughter. Still withstanding, the Soviet units, half starved and frozen, fought back with rabid ferocity even in the last extremity of their wretchedness. It was a resounding defensive victory nonetheless. The Finns had accomplished the impossible. The Kola sector located in Ladoga, Karelia was a pivotal position, for losing it to the Soviets would mean losing the war. But in the weeks to come, the phrase "Kola still stands" would transform the insignificant river into a symbol of resistance. In mid-January, the Soviets deployed over 50 batteries against 20 Finnish guns, with constant human wave attacks all along the line without pause, while thousands of shells rained down on the Finnish defenders. Holding Kola was not a spectacular victory. It was a grinding battle of attrition, and Soviet casualties rose to more than 1,000 men a day. A final wave of Soviet attacks began on March 2nd, but each time the Finnish recovered quickly and Kola held out until the end. When the ceasefire took effect on March 13th, the defenders slowly emerged from their holes and wandered aimlessly over the devastated landscape. The silence was deafening. At Suomussalmi along the Reti Road, the Finnish experienced yet another unexpected attack from the Soviet 163rd and 44th Divisions, who were aiming to cut Finland in half at the waist. The Finnish regiment of JR-27 led the task of destroying the 163rd Division. Though they lacked firepower, JR-27 had mobility, with plenty of ski and men who were well versed with the terrain. With speed and shock, a flurry of men erupted from the forest, grenading the Soviets. The Finnish launched unfaltering attacks on the Soviets throughout day and night, depriving them of sleep, food, and willpower. Eventually, on the 28th of December, the Soviet strongholds collapsed, with more than 5,000 bodies littered along the road. Only the 44th Division was left. Using multi-tactics once again, the Finnish exploited the effects of cold and hunger to divide the column division, then wiping out each dwindling pocket. By January 8th, the stone-stiff bodies of 27,500 Soviets and hundreds of tanks were scattered across the road. Though the Finnish losses amounted to 900 dead and nearly 2,000 injured, Suomussalmi was one of the cleanest, most decisive, and most spectacular Finnish victory in Ladoga, Karelia. Because of this battle, other nations began to see hope in the Finnish retaliation, with 8,000 Swedish, 800 Norwegian and Danish, and 350 Finnish-American volunteers joining their cause. 100,000 women and girls also did much to compensate for Finland's chronic shortage of manpower, working as nurses, cooks, and even soldiers. However, this victory was not to last long. Beginning on February 1st, the Soviets began an aerial attack as a concentrated carpet bombing, the heaviest and most sustained aerial attacks in the history of warfare to date. The new Soviet General Timoshenko opened his offensive with 300,000 shells crashing into the Viipuri gateway within the first 24 hours of the bombardment. Factored into his strategy was a devastating but simple truth. The Soviet units were inexhaustible. Finnish units were not. The cumulative strain on the defenders was designed to grind them down, not only physically but psychologically. Enduring the physical and mental toll of sleeplessness and the deterioration of faculties, the Finnish began to feel the effects of prolonged exposure to war. Yet the defenders hung on in their disintegrating positions, responding time and time again, drawing strength from the deepest human reservoirs of determination and courage, and for 10 unspeakable days, they held out. The Soviets once again launched a major attack against every sector of the line from Taipale to the Gulf of Finland on February 12th, and despite being torn to pieces by Finnish resistance, the devastating result was inevitable. The enemy had broken through the Mannerheim line. As Finnish diplomats fought for a compromise, Mannerheim fought for Finnish land, knowing the importance of Finnish soil in negotiations as leverage. The Finnish had one last battle to fight, the battle for time, the battle for peace. By March 10th, the Finnish were nearly halved in strength, fighting an enemy whose reserves were inexhaustible. And to their horror, the Finns now learned that the treaty terms would be even harsher than they had originally thought. Finland would lose the entire Karelian Isthmus, Hanko, and a great slice of Karelia north of Lake Ladoga. The final decision was a compromise. In the early hours of March 13th, the Treaty of Moscow was signed, and a ceasefire scheduled to go into effect at noon. During the final hour, the firing died down, and the defenders began to think of home and the sheer ecstasy of having survived 105 days of unbearable and unbelievable horror and violence. The Winter War wasn't about territory. It was about the preservation of the Finnish people's identity, culture, and very existence. It was a timeless story of courage against all odds, of a people united to preserve their freedom. Although the compromise was seemingly forced, it effectively resolved a bloody conflict forever ingrained in history. It may have appeared a bitter defeat, but it was truly a victory at heart.